Radio 1 and Sirius XM. You can also catch the show by using the CBC Listen app or subscribe to our podcast.
Put simply, we need more workers, and immigration is the way to get there.
The federal government announced new immigration targets for Canada late last week, aiming to bring in more than 400,000 permanent residents every year for the next 3 years. Those targets are higher than almost any time in this country's history. The goal is to expand Canada's skilled workforce to boost economic growth and blunt the rising costs of an aging population. But can those numbers actually be met in the aftermath of a global pandemic and with the bureaucracy already strained? To answer those questions, I'm joined now by Raquel Dancho. She's a conservative critic for immigration. Welcome to the House.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be here.
Let me start by asking you for your reaction to what the Liberals are proposing. Do you think the number of people that they want to bring into Canada is realistic?
You know, Chris, it was interesting. I was watching the Liberals press conference last week, and aside from the masks, you would never have known that we're in the worst health and economic crisis in a century. There was really no indication or recognition of the challenges faced by the immigration system during the pandemic. So that was the first thing that stood out to me. My office has been inundated with thousands of emails and phone calls since I took over this role a few months ago about the problems since the border closures. Family reunification, we have stranded people abroad that were approved to come to this country as permanent residents, that it's been so long since the borders have closed that their applications have expired, and yet they've quit their jobs, sold their home, bought the plane ticket, and they've received no communications from the federal government of what's going to happen to them. And we believe that this is in the tens of thousands of people that are stranded in their country of origin. So the feasibility of this is in question. We're seeing that the immigration system in Canada is not able to handle the streams right now. So how are we going to do this next year by bringing in 401,000 people? I don't know. And the Liberal government failed to acknowledge that.
Are you suggesting then we should deal with the people who are on waiting lists now before we think about increasing and setting targets?
I think the Minister of Immigration should at the very least have acknowledged the incredible stress and financial hardship that thousands of people are facing by not able to reunite with their families or enter the country as Canada promised them. There was no acknowledgement of that hardship, and frankly, I found that quite cold-hearted.
All right, so then the targets themselves, what is the appropriate number if 401,000 seems unrealistic to you?
You know, I think that's a really great question, and I think that leads me to my second point. How do we safely bring in over 400,000 people next year? The minister failed to give Canadians any indication of that. We know we don't have widespread rapid testing. That should be a given with the 400,000 mark that we're looking at. And the second thing is, you know, not a lot of folks can afford, nor can the taxpayer, to house in hotels for 2 weeks 400,000 people. So we're not clear how this is going to be done safely, and that was particularly a failure in the announcement to acknowledge those safety concerns of Canadians.
I want to come back to the safety question in a second, but what would be a more appropriate number then, do you think?
I think it's a good question, but really what I've been hearing since the announcement last week is the concern for the 9 to 10% of Canadians that are currently out of work. That's over 1 million people that are dependent on CERB right now and other government subsidies. And we know that also housing, there's less than 1% of available housing in Canada. So Canadians have significant concerns with finding a job, with finding a good place to live. And now the Liberal government is saying they're going to bring in almost 500,000 people when there's 1 million people out of work right now. So I think those questions of what the appropriate number is are legitimate. And I would have expected the Liberal Minister of Immigration, with his vast experts of civil servants, to give us some understanding what the strategic numbers we need to fill our unemployment gaps are.
I looked at the breakdown of the numbers, and I'm sure you did too.
I did.
Most of them, more than 50%, are in the economic class, and there are, as you mentioned, skills that need to be filled. Is your view that the focus should be sort of exclusively on those and the family reunification that are already in the system?
Well, I think Canada has the responsibility to fulfill its humanitarian goals. We pride ourselves as being a safe haven for those seeking refuge from war-torn countries and the like, and I think we need to make sure we're maintaining that. That's very important to Canadians, and we've seen a significant drop in refugees accepted into the country since the pandemic. So that is of grave concern. Family reunification is a critical issue. People are facing significant mental health concerns, financial restraint, and it's been a real problem. We've heard heartbreaking stories of people not being able to unite with their dying loved ones in Canada, and yet here we are, the Liberal government is saying it's going to bring in 400,000 people next year, and yet it can't even reunite dying family members. So there's a significant concern, and there should have been acknowledgement of the hardship faced by those people that the immigration system under this Liberal government has let down, and there wasn't.
All right. You mentioned safely, and you mentioned rapid testing. testing might ease some of the concerns you have about whether it safely can bring in the numbers that we're talking about here. What would that have done, the rapid testing?
Well, I think we're seeing some pilot projects across the country for rapid testing at airports, for example. We're seeing this across the world as well. Countries are trying to figure out how to function in a COVID world, and rapid testing has been a key tool in that toolbox.
Right. But these are targets, right? So we will have rapid testing potentially when these targets begin next year.
Well, I hope so, but the Liberal government hasn't given Canadians much confidence that that's going to happen. It's been very slow to get rapid testing into this country.
I also wanted to ask how you would shape the system to ensure that the areas in which there's a skills shortage, that those are filled through immigration.
Well, I think one of the concerns we saw in the summer, and I've heard this from my agriculture colleagues in the Conservative caucus, that it was incredibly challenging to bring in temporary foreign workers with all the complications with the border closures, and that contributed to rotting produce on fields. It hurt farmers. So we need a better plan next spring. If God help us, if we're still dealing with this problem, we're going to need a more effective plan of how we're going to manage that, because the food security depends on it.
But that's the temporary foreign worker program. That's not immigration. It's a different program.
Well, it's an immigration stream.
Right.
That was impacted.
But what we're talking about is permanent new residents to try and deal with with skills shortages. So I'm wondering where you think that focus should be.
Well, I do think that the minister did mention healthcare. So I think that there is a valid point to be made there, that if we can bring in more permanent residents that can support our healthcare system, I think everyone would welcome that. But again, the government announced 401,000 people to be brought into the country next year and failed to explain in detail, or even with any real indication of where these individuals are going to work, where are the specific labor gaps. So I can't tell you how many emails and phone calls I've received in the last week, people asking these details. I'm thinking, well, why didn't the Liberal government provide Canadians more confidence in this decision last week? I'm not sure.
Okay, I have to leave it there. Thank you, Raquel Dancho.
Thank you so much, Chris.